Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 84 in the series. Sadly, I'm calling this one Broken But Still Knitting, and I'll explain that in a minute. Everything's okay, it's just the knitting has hit a little road bump, let's say. So I am coming to you from Urbana, Illinois, where I'm a professor at the university there. I teach a lot of science and speculative fiction and science studies and things like that. And those of you who are coming back, welcome back. You may have noticed that the room has kind of been transformed. We've got a little Star Wars over here, we got a little science fiction over here, and that is because this yarn room has now become my teaching studio, office, all that kind of good stuff. So I'm teaching a science fiction class online, and this is where I Zoom, this is where I record my, I'm calling them podcasts for the class, not lectures. Yeah, so, and if you're interested in checking out those podcasts, I'll put a link in the show notes for anybody who likes to hear random podcast stuff about science fiction history and Frankenstein, and I think I just did a series on the pulps. So anyway, I'll make those available to you guys if you're curious to check out what a science fiction class podcast looks like. Otherwise, stuff is going okay here. In the last week or so, I had a little run-in with, this thing. I'm not sure what to say about it. You are seeing a homemade wrap with a popsicle stick. A removable popsicle stick, I might add. I think I broke this knuckle on my pinky. Oftentimes this is called, I think, like a boxer's fracture, if you accidentally hit on this knuckle. I practice Hart as part of my exercise routine, and it's a Korean mixed martial art that I used to practice when I was younger for 10 years. And I think I must have just, slammed it a little bit. It swelled up and it got kind of hurty, and then I wrapped it and it's feeling better. It feels good like this. With the popsicle stick, it's like, no problem. Plus it keeps me from bending and everything. I can still do a lot. I can still make food and knit just a little, but right now I'm making socks for my son Zach at his request, and those little size 1 needles, I tend to knit, I guess, by wrapping my pinkies around the needles, and yeah, that's not working out so well right now. So anyway, yeah, this is my homemade wrap. I'm gonna leave it on for a couple of weeks and see how things go. I know all of you doctors and nurses out there are like, no, go get an x-ray. But even in the best of times, I'm not a huge fan of going in for medical stuff. So in a pandemic, I'm definitely just like, this feels good. I'm good. I don't need to know. Self-care. Anyway, this is why it's called Broken But Still Knitting. I have kind of switched over to a different project where I'm putting pre-knit things together so that I'm not having to strain my hand so much. So we'll see how it goes. So what should I tell you? For those of you who are coming back, it's lovely to see you. And after the last episode, I got so many messages from so many of you about the knitting history segment that I'm really excited to continue that, and I hope I'll get more messages from you guys because you had some great leads and some good ideas. And in fact, somebody brought up there's a great book called Canada Knits, and I am going to talk about that one in an upcoming cast, which is really awesome. Plus, somebody else had a question about the history of yoked sweaters, and anyway, it's been wonderful to hear from you. If you are new, this is a podcast about garment design and DIY and garment modification mostly, with a lot of other stuff kind of sprinkled in. So if you're new, welcome, and I hope you enjoy what you see. Let's see. So a couple of quick notes before we get into the show itself. This is the last kind of call for our 2 cals that are going on. We've got a Disc Stitch cal and a Knits in Translation cal that have both been going on for the year. And I want to call them on October 1st and go through the threads and pick the prize winners for those round about the beginning of October. So if you want to get in on it, there's still time. All the info is over on our Ravelry page, and I hope you'll come and join us for some fun. And there'll be some new cals coming up in the fall, I hope. Yeah. And then the other message is to say a big thank you to anyone who's sent me a coffee in the last month or two. That is Mary and Kimber, Sarah, Leah, and Lynn. Thank you all so much for sending the Ko-fis. I appreciate your support, and it's what keeps the podcast running behind the scenes, so thank you. All right, what are we going to do today? I'm going to talk to you about my sock whip, which is going to probably stay a whip for a while because of my popsicle stick. And then I've got a blanket that I've been sewing together. It's for the Knit Together project that I started back in 2017, and I'm finally getting around to because life intervened, and I think about maybe 30 sweaters intervened, but I'm back to it. And finally, I have a segment on the history of knitting. This time it's going to be about the first section of this book, which is Wool by Peggy Hart. Incredibly awesome book, and we're going to talk about the first part, which is colonial knitting and wool. Fun stuff all around. So let's start with the whip, because at least I have one sock finished and you can check it out. My son Zach requested, he came home after I think it was the ski trip that a lot of high schoolers took back in January, and one of his friends had some homemade socks that his grandma had made, and he was like, hey, can you make me some socks? Now I want you to know, I've not been the kind of mother that wouldn't make my child socks. Well, kind of. I've made him socks before. I think they ended up in the dryer. I know. So yeah, I wanted to honor his request for socks, and so of course I made him a sweater before I made him socks. Anyway, I'm actually making him socks now. And I picked out some socks from this book, which is the Folk Sock book, and this is by Nancy Bush. It's a really wonderful kind of tour through a bunch of different traditions of sock knitting, and the ones I liked are actually on the cover. They're called the country socks. Here they are in all their glory. And I actually just decided to make those socks. So I got some Brown Sheep Company Nature Spun Sport yarn in both the charcoal and the white colors, and that's what I've been knitting. So you guys know who have been watching a while, I like to put socks on my hand because it gives you an accurate representation of what they look like on a foot. So this is one of the country socks, and it is in this beautiful charcoal color and the contrasting cuff, heel, and toe, which is just their natural color, their natural white. And I haven't woven in the ends yet because this sock actually had a different toe than I'm used to, and I'm still undecided as to whether I like it. I love the yarn. The yarn is super stretchy, really actually very thick, and it's an excellent sock yarn, I think, because these are meant to be kind of hiking socks, and I think they'll stand up really well. Plus all this ribbing and this modified kind of seed stitch in between as part of the ribs is a really nice touch, and it makes it so that the socks are super, like they really hold onto your leg well. So these fit me and Spencer and Zach, because we all have really big feet, if you couldn't tell. And I left my little markers in like I do for sweaters, so you can see where the decreases are, and I can see where they are for the next sock. But let me show you the toe. This is a round toe. I'm not a huge sock knitter. I knit socks for a long time, and I usually use the Susan B. Anderson How I Knit My Socks pattern because I like it so much. And so pretty much every sock pattern that I make, I compare it to that one, or I check it against that one because I think it's an excellent pattern. So this is a round toe rather than my usual toe. And my usual toe would be to get to the end and then do my decreases all along each side so that there's no seam on the top or the bottom. I really dislike seams when I'm walking on socks, like under my foot, and I don't want to feel anything really on the top of my foot as I'm walking. So for me, this round toe just introduces a lot of seams that may not be super necessary, but it looks like the top of a hat, which I think is kind of cool. I had my son try them on, and he didn't notice the seam at all. This is the seam that would run right underneath your toes, and it's a little flattened, and he said it was fine. So if he's okay with it, I might just go with it. Otherwise, if he didn't like it, I would just pull it out and put my regular toe in there. Super simple to knit. Really nice, kind of good hiking sock. It's a good height. You are doing some decreases just because it is a little bit higher than maybe some socks for folks. I like it a lot, and I'm down to, I made it this far, just the cuff down to, I finished almost all the decreases for the second one before the, broken but still knitting. And I really do like that brown sheep yarn. It's the only thing about it that I don't like is that it's moth-proofed, which that's chemically. I'm not really down with that. It just says moth-proof, which means it's had some chemical put in it to keep the insects away, which I didn't realize at the time because I assumed nature spun would be natural. Silly of me to assume that. So not a big fan of the moth-proofing, whatever that is. And I just saw in my bag that I have my pattern for the Susan B. Anderson socks that I was telling you guys about. You can see that it is well loved. It has notes all over it, sticky notes, hashtags, all kinds of marks. I have the names of Dad, Amy, my good friend Amy. I have Steve, Zach, Spencer. I have all their measurements, the number of stitches I need for everybody's different sized feet. So it's a well-loved pattern, and it comes with me everywhere. I should probably get it like laminated or something if I'm going to keep it around for much longer. Just put it that way. So that is my work in progress, and it is going to probably be in progress for a little while because of ye old popsicle stick. I should say ye old knuckle instead of popsicle stick, but I like the popsicle stick. Turns out we didn't even have to eat any popsicles. Like Spencer had a lot of popsicle sticks in the shop, maybe from when Zach was little and we used to do art projects or something. I don't know, but he had a whole container of popsicle sticks, so they're like perfectly clean and ready to go, and it just makes sense. It makes sense. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the Knit Together project. This is what I've actually turned my attention to because the knitting is a little bit difficult. So back in 2017, when I was starting this podcast up, one of the things I wanted to do was really connect with people and figure out ways for us to knit together, like do a project together. And I was kind of inspired by, I think it was on Fibertrack. Sarah of Fibertrack had... she had shown a blanket in which the squares were from different places and people, and I thought, God, that would be so cool to do. So in 2017, I bought a bunch of kind of wooden DPN sets of various sizes. I asked some of the other podcasters that I knew if they wanted in on this project, and so I sent them needles first, and the instructions were, please knit an 8x8 square out of some yarn that has a story behind it, and then once you're done, send the needles and the instructions on to the next person. And these, I think I sent out maybe 5 sets of needles. These needles went around the world, like Ireland and the UK, they were in France, all over the United States, and I got a total of 30 squares for this blanket, which worked out perfectly because as I laid them out yesterday, I did a 6x5, and it was like this perfect blanket. And so then I started messing with the squares to see, we need to have some symmetry here and some symmetry there. And once I had everything put together, everyone's tagged on their blanket squares, and I've been mattress stitching the rows together. So these particular squares, this one's by Tawny McEwen, this is Shirley Young, who was up in Chicago at the time, Leslie Busalova, I think I'm pronouncing all the names right, Mary Jo Martinek, and Maggie Nichols are all represented in this row of the blanket, and they each sent along stories that go along with their yarn. So if you're interested, earlier in the podcast, back in 2017, as I was receiving these squares, I was often reading off their letters on the podcast as part of the podcast, and you might remember that. It was so long ago. I'm a terrible, terrible finisher of this blanket, but it's getting done now. So each of these squares has a story, and they're coming together really nicely. I have just been mattress stitching them up together, and then what I'm going to do is put a big border on the blanket. I'll show you one more row. It's good there's work you can do when you can't knit. This row is a little bit different because it's a little more colorful, and I'm upside down, I think. Yeah. So this is Amy Vander Ark is this beautiful purple heart. Oh, I'm upside down. It is. I am upside down. Amy Vander Ark, this is the purple heart here. And then this one was from France. This is Stephanie of Étoile Lune Soleil. You can follow her on Instagram. This one is from Suzanne, who's the sheepish spinner. Look at all that color. And this one is from Kate Nicol. This is, she's a fellow podcaster in Ireland who I love. And I have a bunch of her bags, which are like right within reach there. She made some beautiful bags. that I've often used for socks. And this is Kate Boyd's square. I've seen a few of them that are on the bias, and they all have this great story, and they all come from this yarn that has some kind of meaning to the people who used it to make their squares. So I am knitting up I'm mattress stitching the rows together first, and then I'll do the mattress stitch the rows together, and then I'm going to add a border to the whole thing, and it's going to be shipped off. The whole deal was that if you entered a square, you would have a chance to win the blanket, so it's going to be shipped off to one of the people who sent in the squares. It was a really fun project. I really wish I had just wrapped it up and completed it right in 2017 and 2018, but it's cool. Sometimes time gets away from you, and it's all right. I had a friend post on Facebook recently, I think it was just yesterday, that she felt really bad, like her garden had just kind of gone to like wild over the summer because she just hadn't had the time to tend it in all the ways that she wanted to. And I just wrote back to her and I said, we have the exact same thing happening here. We both got really busy. Pandemic stuff happened, school stuff happened with the kids and the trips and the this and the sheep and the, stuff happens. And I said, but the wild garden is still producing vegetables for us, and it's kind of beautiful that way. You kind of push through some of the weeds and look, there's a butternut squash, or hey, there's green peppers are growing over here and they didn't even need to be tended. So I'm kind of a fan of the wild garden, and the kind of time can sometimes get away from you, and in the end you kind of come back to something with an even better perspective, and no one's the worse for the whole thing. So the Knit Together project is happening. I'm really excited. It's putting me back in touch with a lot of you who submitted squares, and I've been trying to tag everyone on the Instagram posts. So if you submitted a square and I don't have your Instagram handle, send me a message and I will tag you once I get more of the blanket finished, so that everybody can see who's involved in the Knit Together project this time around. And maybe we'll do it again sometime. Let me know if you'd like to do another Knit Together project. Maybe I'd promise to get it done within, a year. Okay, so that's what I've been doing. That's what I've been busying myself with, aside from all the science fiction lectures and getting the beginning of the semester off to a good start. So how about we move on to a little knitting history. Last time we talked about Kate Davies and her Yokes book and the history of labor in knitting, and kind of like the inspiration for this segment, like what got me interested in knitting history, and a lot of it had to do with her book. And as you may have noticed, we're going to kind of jump around here a little bit. I think it's a little bit more fun that way. Just like the wild garden, I want this to be a fun thing for me. It's kind of what I'm reading or what I found and what I want to share with you. So that's what we're going to do. And today what I have for you is Wool: Unraveling an American Story of Artists and Artisans and Innovation by Peggy Hart. And Peggy Hart is a production weaver, and she's traveled around the world, and this book focuses largely on the United States. And I'm going to talk to you about the first part of it, which is about the colonial period, which she defines as 1609 to 1780. And I would say that in this book, which is about the US primarily, she does mention at a few different moments the impact that wool has had on both indigenous peoples in the United States and those who were forced to come to the United States, forced to emigrate here as slaves. So her story tries to be as inclusive as possible. It can always be more inclusive, but I think it's worth noting that right off the bat. So in large part, the story that she's trying to tell in this book has everything to do with our relationship with wool and how that relationship has changed as technology and innovation and synthetic products and other forces have kind of changed the way that we relate to wool and sheep and the way that we need or don't need their products because we have replacements for them or because they've been pushed out of certain industry standards and things like that. So she's starting with the colonial period, and she's going all the way up into the 1980s, pretty much. So that last segment in the 50s to the 80s is a lot about synthetic fibers and post-World War II. If you think about consumption, just as a basic kind of metric for our relationship with wool, one of the things she notes early on in the book is that if you look at consumption per capita in the United States, say in the 19th century until now, so let's go a little bit beyond the colonial period here just to begin with. But in 1840, she says that there were basically per capita in the United States, we used 4.5 pounds of wool. Okay, let's think about how much that is. 4.5 pounds of wool is like a small fleece per capita in the United States. Then by 1880, we're up to 8.5 pounds. And by 1890, we're at 9 pounds. So wool is like, if we were to graph it, it's like wool is on the rise, wool use is on the rise. And then all kinds of industrialization and synthetic fibers and all kinds of other things happen. And today we only consume about 1.5 pounds per capita in the United States. And she compares that to, say, like, 2 pairs of socks or something, a very small amount of wool that we're using. Now, in part, that's because we have things like fleece and Gore-Tex and synthetic fibers of all kinds that we think keep us warm. But, I used to wear that stuff, and when I switched over to wool, I've never been warmer. So I have to just give a little shout out to wool here, as I usually do. A couple of things that I'd note about her discussion of the colonial period in particular. One is that it was actually pretty difficult to establish sheep flocks on the mainland of in the colonies, in part because of the number of wolves that were actually here, especially on the East Coast. And maybe we don't think about wolves so much today, but they were a big factor in sheep flocks in the colonial period. So a lot of sheep flocks were actually raised on the islands that are on that East Coast, up north as well as down south. And the islands were safer simply because the wolves weren't there, and the flocks of sheep thrived, and that was a pretty interesting, I think, an innovative approach, a problem-solving approach to, like, well, on the mainland we've got wolves, this is a problem, let's put the sheep on the islands. Hey, it's working. So that's kind of cool. Another thing that she mentions is that the part of the tension between Britain and a lot of the colonies and colonists had to do with wool, in part because the colonists, like the administrators of the colonies, were pretty much encouraging the domestic manufacture of wool, and there were a bunch of acts that were in place that would encourage that. So in 1656, families were encouraged, or there was an act in place that they must spin 3 pounds of fiber 30 weeks out of the year. So for each of those 30 weeks, they had to spin 3 pounds of fiber. That was in 1656. In 1664, there was an act that required youths to learn spinning and weaving. And England basically didn't like this because England was making some bank on exporting its wool and its wool products to the colonies and having them pay for it, just like a lot of other products. So this was yet another source of economic and political tension between England and the colonies, was wool, and should wool be domestically manufactured or not. So that pretty fun and interesting thing to think about. It's not just the Boston Tea Party, but the domestic wool manufacturing is kind of an important part of the story. A couple other cool facts that I found in here. One was that scouring was done with urine, and maybe some of you knew this, and I think I remember seeing something about it in I think it was a YouTube video about the medieval period, maybe? I'm trying to remember. This is how you do it. This description is one from the Domestic Manufacturer's Assistant, one of the first tracts published for the woolen industry. And this is the quote, "In the first place, fill the kettle 2/3 with water and 1/3 with urine, that which is old if you can get it. You will then heat this liquor as warm as you can bear your hand in it for 1 or 2 seconds, put in 5 or 6 pounds of wool loosely into it, and there you go." And it sounds like, I'm going to go on and read here a little bit more. She says, urine for this purpose was often collected in taverns and rooming houses, with a preference being for the urine of beer drinkers. And here's a quote again, probably from the Domestic Manufacturer's Assistant. "The cider and gin drinkers are considered to produce the worst, and the beer drinkers the best." So if you need to scour some wool, get some urine. I don't want to be there, but there you go. And the last thing I want to draw your attention to from this period that I thought was pretty interesting is that we think of wool as often something that we wear on our bodies, but it's important to remember that households in the colonial period, and even after to a certain extent, used wool for all kinds of household goods. So beds would have 2 or 3 wool blankets on them to try to keep warm in the winter. And if you had enough money and resources, you would also have wool curtains hanging around your bed. So here's an image of some of those wool curtains. Let's see if it'll pop in. There you go. And these wool curtains were not only for warmth, but another property of wool that many of you probably know about is that it is fire retardant. So if you have wool curtains around your bed and you happen to have a fireplace in the room, or you have candles or other flames in the room, the curtains around your bed could actually prevent a fire from killing you in your sleep. Hey, wool, the best thing since sliced bread. It helps with everything from like keeping warm to keeping yourself from being too warm in a fire. So I'm gonna go on. I've been reading a little bit more of Hart's book, and if I find other bits and bobs in there that are fun, I'll come back to it in a future cast on the history of knitting, but I'm going to kind of keep mixing it up, so we won't be doing just a straight look at one book every time, and I think next time I might do some of the Canada Knits book and just try to bring you some of these fun stories from the history of knitting and wool and sheep raising and all that kind of good stuff. There is a new book out, and it's the history of the world through sheep, something like that, and one of you recommended it to me, and I am going to read that as well, and I'll talk to you about that in one of these future casts. Yeah, so much out there. There's so much information on the history of knitting, and it's so much fun, and we're just like barely scratching the surface. So I think this will keep us pretty animated for quite a long time, and we'll see how long we keep it up. All right, the last thing for today is the Bad Sheep yarn giveaway. So many of you will remember in the last episode, Marcy of Bad Sheep Yarn sent along a huge set of the 2020 Alaska collection on worsted weight yarn. And we talked all about it. They're all beautiful, from Grizzly to Lupine to Denali, the gray one in there. They're just gorgeous skeins, and so many of you liked so many of the colors. I think Sitka Spruce might have been one of the top picks. That's this beautiful greenish variegated skein here. I love that one too. It's beautiful. So we had 384 entries for the complete set of yarn, and the winner is Carla Linsenich. I think I got the last name right, Linsenich. And it's Lintzenich. And Carla, I've sent you a notification on Instagram, and yeah, get in touch with me. I will put this in the post to you, because that is going to be a lot of good knitting. And thank you so much to Marcy of Bad Sheep Yarn for sending out this beautiful giveaway and for creating wonderful color for the world. And if you haven't checked out Bad Sheep Yarn, head over to her website, see what she's got in production. I think she's just about to introduce yet another new colorway into the world sometime this next week. So yeah, tag it, bookmark it, and head on over there. Thank you for this giveaway, and it is off to Carla, who I hope will enjoy it. Thanks to everyone who entered, and I'll have another giveaway for you guys soon, I hope. Yeah, so I think that's it for today. I'm gonna go and, rest my hand and do a little mattress stitching. I hope you guys are all well and taking good care in the pandemic, and I will see you again in a couple of weeks. Take care.